Welcome to the explainer. So, think about this. In our culture, we are basically hardwired from birth to judge our decisions purely by their outcomes, right? Like if a business strategy works, we're incredibly quick to call it absolutely brilliant. But if a new product launches and immediately hits some bottleneck, well, we label it a complete failure. But what if that entire way of thinking is just fundamentally flawed? Today, we're going to completely shift how you judge your choices. We are breaking down the anatomy of a truly great decision, and we're moving our focus away from that final outcome and putting it exactly where it belongs, on the integrity of your process. To see exactly why this shift is absolutely crucial, let's actually start with a really eye-opening mental exercise from author and former pro poker player Annie Duke, from her fantastic book, Thinking in Bets. I want you to take a second, right now, and think of your absolute best decision in the past year. Got it? Okay, now think of your absolute worst decision. Well, I'm willing to bet that your best decision was followed by a great result, and your worst decision was followed by a terrible result. And this perfectly exposes a universal cognitive flaw that trips us up all the time. We link our results directly with our decisions, as if it's this perfect one-to-one ratio. Which brings us to Section 1, the resulting trap. Let's dive right into this core problem. Why do we naturally but completely incorrectly conflate a good result with a brilliant decision? Well, Annie Duke calls this cognitive trap resulting. It's basically the ultimate Monday morning quarterback mindset. When we work backward from the final results to figure out why things happened, we fall into a massive trap. We assume causation where there's really only correlation. And honestly, we end up pounding a lot of square pegs into round holes just to maintain this comforting illusion that our choices perfectly control our outcomes. In doing so, we completely ignore the huge role that luck and just hidden information play in our everyday lives. And here's an example that brilliantly illustrates just how dangerous resulting can be. Imagine a drunk driver who miraculously manages to get home safely without crashing. Was deciding to drive a good decision? Well, of course not. That is just pure dumb luck. No sober person thinks drunk driving is suddenly a brilliant strategy just because of one lucky outcome, right? But on the flip side, imagine a clinical study. It's incredibly well-reasoned, expertly planned, executed perfectly, but it hits an unforeseen bottleneck and fails. Guys, that's bad luck. That is not a bad decision. A truly great decision can lead to a bad result, and a terrible decision can occasionally lead to a good result. So to be a highly effective decision maker, you have got to detach your ego from the outcome and focus entirely on the integrity of your process. Moving on to Section 2, luck versus skill. Because if we can't judge a decision simply by how it turns out, how are we supposed to learn anything? We have to start viewing the future for what it really is, a probabilistic map, where every single outcome is a mix of our own control and pure chance. Think of yourself as a baseball outfielder, deciding exactly where to throw the ball. When an outcome happens, you have to mentally sort it into one of two buckets. If making the exact same choice again would predictably result in the same outcome, well, that belongs in the skill bucket. That's the stuff in your control. But if the outcome only happened because of weather, or the unpredictable actions of other people, or totally hidden information you couldn't have known, that goes straight into the luck bucket. Sorting these experiences correctly is how we actually learn from our lives without getting totally delusional. But here is where our ego desperately tries to hijack our learning loop. We are all heavily prone to something called the self-serving bias. And let's be honest, it's pretty easy to see ourselves doing this. When things go well, we instinctively toss that outcome into the skill bucket, right? We pat ourselves on the back for being absolute geniuses. But when things go poorly, oh, well, that was just bad luck. By processing the world this way, we actively reinforce terrible decisions simply because we got lucky once. We end up missing vital opportunities to objectively analyze our real decision quality. We absolutely have to break this cycle. So let's talk about how we do that in Section 3, embracing conscious ignorance. To break the bias cycle, the very first step is checking our ego at the door and realistically appraising our own ignorance. The legendary psychologist Daniel Kahneman identified a fascinating cognitive rule he called WYSIT. What you see is all there is. Basically, our brains are incredibly adept at taking just a tiny little bit of limited information and constructing a highly comforting, coherent story out of it while completely ignoring all the things we don't know. But the reality is Annie Duke's probabilistic map. The world is inherently uncertain. And acknowledging that we don't have all the facts, yeah, it's far less comforting, but it is infinitely more calibrated to reality.
I absolutely love this quote from the physicist James Clerk Maxwell. In our culture, especially in school or in business, saying I don't know or I'm not sure is so often treated as a failure. We see it as a sign of weakness, but we have to reframe that entirely. Having the courage to stand up and say, I am not sure, is an absolute superpower. It is the practice of thoroughly conscious ignorance, and it is the absolute prerequisite for gathering more data and making a highly calibrated choice. It doesn't mean there's no objective truth out there. It just means you are open-minded enough to actually go seek it out.
That takes us to Section 4, organizing disagreement. Because once we finally admit that we don't know everything, our next logical step is to actively seek out exactly what we are missing.
The author Robert Greene maps out the difference between rational and irrational decision makers perfectly. Irrational decision makers are driven by highly emotional responses. They get instantly defensive, and they're pretty much incapable of introspection. But rational decision makers, they actually readily admit their own irrational tendencies. They focus on long-term goals rather than short-term ego boosts. And because they've detached their ego from the outcome, they actively invite transparency and criticism into their teams. They literally want to hear why they might be wrong before they make the choice.
So how do we build this into a practical strategy? Well, we can look to Daniel Kahneman again. He points out that our standard practice of having open meetings gives way too much weight to the opinions of people who just speak early and assertively. It causes everyone else to just quietly line up behind them. Hello, groupthink. To combat this, Kahneman proposes a brilliant step-by-step independent judgment process. It goes like this. First, you introduce the issue. Second, everyone writes a brief summary of their position completely silently. And finally, you open the discussion based strictly on those diverse written notes. It perfectly protects the group against false consensus and forces you to confront different perspectives.
And finally, Section 5, the integrity of process. We have stopped judging purely by outcomes, we've embraced our ignorance, and we've organized disagreement. Now it's time to bring all these elements together and define what a high-integrity decision process actually looks like when it is time to take action.
The crucial point here is captured beautifully by the legendary Silicon Valley executive coach Bill Campbell. He used to tell leaders, do something even if it's wrong. Now, why on earth would he say that? Because indecision in business is incredibly damaging. There's rarely a perfect answer waiting for you. But having a well-run, honest, transparent process to arrive at your decision, that is what actually gives your team confidence. It keeps everyone moving forward together. Bruce Chizen, the former CEO of Adobe, used to call this making decisions with integrity. You follow a solid process, you prioritize the right thing for the enterprise over any one individual ego, you make the absolute best choice you can, and you move on.
And when you do move on, you have to fully commit. Management guru Peter Drucker gives us these amazing rules for effective action. First off, always compare the risk of action against the risk of doing nothing. Once you determine those benefits outweigh the risks, you must act definitively. Drucker uses this brilliant analogy. He says, treat every major decision like surgery. Listen, a surgeon doesn't just take out half the appendix because they're feeling a little nervous. That just causes more infection and shock. A well-processed decision requires courageous, complete action, no hedging. Do not make wishy-washy compromises just to appease people. You either operate or you don't. Which brings us to our final thought, and a question I really want you to sit with today. Think about the very next major choice you have to make, whether it's in your life or your business. Is that next decision going to be driven by a Monday morning quarterback fear of the final outcome, or will it be driven by the integrity of your process? Remember, the world out there is a probabilistic map. Outcomes are so often completely out of your hands. But your process, your willingness to say I don't know, to organize disagreement, and to act courageously, that is entirely up to you. Make your process great, and the rest will follow. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.